Hello everyone, welcome to Lecture 12, Predation, Defense, and Escape. For today's lecture, I want you to think about two questions in particular. What are some strategies for predator avoidance in amphibians and reptiles? And two, what are some strategies for escaping predators with both amphibians and reptiles? So let's go ahead and get started. Predation is the greatest cause of mortality in natural populations of amphibians and reptiles. That's a really important point that I want you to remember. It is the greatest cause of mortality. In fact, the large majority of amphibians and reptiles never reach sexual maturity. They never survive that long. And this predation can occur at any life stage, from eggs all the way up through adults. With eggs, they can be eaten by things like insects, leeches, fishes, bacteria, any host of other amphibian and reptile species, in fact. Adults can be preyed on by insects or any other vertebrate groups, from fishes to mammals and birds. It's also important to note that any trait that reduces predation is under strong selection pressure. Most amphibians and reptiles employ several defensive mechanisms which can change depending on the life stage. And we'll talk about examples of each of those. Now, the diversity of predator escape mechanisms in amphibians and reptiles continues to surprise herpetologists, and we're finding new defense mechanisms all the time. So these are the 6 predator avoidance mechanisms that we're going to talk about today, and we'll talk about each of these in succession and provide some examples for each. Let's first talk about escaping detection. This one is by far the most simple. Simply not be present when a predator is searching for prey. An example of this could be you might want to alter your activity patterns. Perhaps you become nocturnal. So you're now limiting the activity or the time period when the time period at which you're active, so that it does not coincide with periods of activity where predators are actively foraging for food. Now, obviously, there are some trade-offs in this particular scenario, in that highly nocturnal activities might limit energy acquisition rates, where most of the food happens to be diurnal, right? So there are some trade-offs. The second factor is crypsis and immobility. So in crypsis, you're having coloration or morphology that resembles aspects of the environment in which that particular organism lives. Now, oftentimes, if you're relying on crypsis, you're oftentimes being immobile because that adaptation is most effective when coupled with immobility. So let's look at some examples. Here we have 2 different species of individuals with body color that blend in or camouflage with the environment. Here on the right, you can see really characteristic leaf litter on the forest floor, and we have here our copperhead. Okay, you can see the snake is quite well camouflaged. Pay attention to the panel on the left where we have our green frogs, and I'll give you just a minute. Count how many gray tree frogs you can see on the side of this tree. You should have come up with 10 gray tree frogs. I'll give you a minute to try to find the rest of them. Actually, I'm just kidding. There's only 4, but they are highly camouflaged. There's the first one, there's the second one, there's the third one, and there's the 4th one. Highly effective at blending in with the environment. You can also have polymorphic coloration, and this is where individuals within a species have different colors and patterns. This makes it more difficult for predators to form a reliable search image. So here you can see our Pacific tree frog, a green morph with dark spots, a brown morph, and another green frog with a very tan colored spots. Again, same species, different morphs, really makes it difficult for a predator to develop that search image. Or you could change your body shape. Okay, so modifications of body shape, like our Suriname toad. Look at the elongate fingers, very wide, flat, triangular shaped head. Vine snakes look much like vines. So this enhances the color of camouflage and resembles a structural aspect of the environment. We've talked on and off throughout the semester about aposematic coloration. This is bright coloration in animals that produce noxious or lethal chemicals from skin glands, and is found in many species of frogs and salamanders. Predators either learn or evolve recognition of these warning colors. So a great example would be our poison dart frogs, which are very brightly colored and produce a noxious substance that ultimately results in neuromuscular transmission, blocking that, resulting in respiratory paralysis or even death. This is an adaptation for diurnal foraging. So oftentimes species that have this aposematic coloration are active most often diurnally when animals can see them, right? So it just makes sense. You can also have this aposematic coloration as well as postural warning, which consists of defensive postures that help scare predators away. So here's some great examples of these dart frogs with aposematic coloration, very brightly colored, again, to advertise their toxicity to would-be predators. Here we have some postural warning in a very common pet trade species, which is our fire-bellied toad, Bombina. You can see the fire-bellied toad rolls over on his back, exposes that bright orange, yellowish belly that says, I'm highly toxic and noxious, you don't want to consume me. So that's a postural warning called an Unken reflex. We've talked about the Unken reflex in some of our salamandrid species as well. Other ways in which they can utilize postural warning are those large eyes. Here we have the red-eyed tree frog, blends in quite well when his legs are tucked in next to the size of his body. He closes his eyes. If a potential predator approaches, immediately opens up those big red eyes and it startles the predator and allows the frog to escape to a nearby leaf or branch. You can also employ mimicry, and there are two types. Batesian mimicry is the first and the most common that we have here in the United States. It occurs when a non-toxic species mimics a toxic or protected one. A second type of mimicry is Mullerian mimicry. It occurs when one or more potentially dangerous species resemble each other, and each is both the model and the mimic. And we're not going to talk too much about Mullerian mimicry, but we are going to give you lots of examples on Batesian mimicry. So I would certainly know what the definition of Batesian mimicry is, and a couple of example species that employ that, not only in the United States, but specifically in Indiana. So sort of the classic example of Batesian mimicry occurs in our coral snakes. Here we have the coral snake on the right, and remember the old mnemonic that helps you remember that this is a toxic or a venomous species. Red on yellow, kill a fellow, whereas its mimic, the scarlet snake, red on black, friend of Jack. It's non-venomous. So here we have a non-venomous species that resembles a venomous species as a warning to say, you know, I might be particularly venomous, so you might want to leave me alone and steer clear, even though this particular species is quite harmless. In the amphibian world, we have some models as well. Here we have Batesian mimicry and Amazonian leaf litter frogs, non-toxic individual, very similar in appearance to its toxic counterpart. In Indiana, we have the red morph of the redback salamander, which is also non-toxic, which very closely resembles the red F stage of our eastern newt, which we know is toxic and has those tetrodotoxins, which are really potent, particularly at the red F stage. Another way to avoid predators is simply to try to run away. And so the action of running away and hiding from predators is a really highly evolved primary escape mechanism, especially for species like active foragers that are very, very fast and nimble and able to run away and find a hiding spot very quickly. There's also several mechanisms by which animals will escape predators. And here are the 5 that we're going to talk about in succession. First are skin, armor, and spines. All of these structures can protect an animal from a predator attack. All of these are also found outside of the body. They're far more developed in reptiles and much less developed in amphibians. We also have chemical defense, and this is where we have glands that are producing irritating, distasteful, or lethal compounds. Now, this is very pronounced in many of our amphibian species, and many of the examples we've already shared with you, some we just talked about. But in amphibians, they have these glandular glands that produce chemicals ranging from mildly irritating, mildly distasteful, all the way to lethal. These glands can be located on the head. If you think about the parotid glands in our toads, or on highly prolific in the tails, think about some of the ambystoma and the different types of displays that they employ to advertise those chemical defenses. Or they can be evenly spread across the entire body surface, as what you see in the poison dart frogs that we just talked about. Now, the source of these chemicals comes mostly from the diet, in particular arthropods such as ants that might possess things like formic acid that help make them very distasteful, will be translated onto these particular amphibian through their glands as well. Now, with regard to reptiles and their chemical defense, turtles have musk glands. Remember when we talked about those musk turtles and where those glands are located and the function of those musk glands. Snakes and some other reptiles like lizards will also have cloacal glands that are emptied on predators and produce that really foul smell. And we've talked about that when we're talking about the natural history of many of our lizards and snakes as well. So let's look at some examples of skin armor and spines, again, highly prolific in many of our reptile species. So here's some examples of those really prominent spines. So just note where those spines tend to be located on some of these species and why they might be limited there. We've talked about chemical defense in terms of skin secretions with a lot of our amphibians, whether they be anurans or chaudates. So think about examples for those. What I'm not going to talk about is chemical defense in terms of blood squirting, but I do highly encourage everyone to copy and paste this URL into YouTube and watch the video that's associated with the horned lizard. It's a really phenomenal video and a really ingenious way that this lizard has evolved to escape predation, particularly with canid predators, things like coyotes. So again, watch that YouTube video, you will not be disappointed. You can also feign death, and we've already talked about the classic, most theatrical reptile that we have in Indiana, which is our eastern hognose snake. I read an excerpt from a book chapter from a good colleague of mine, Jim Harding, on exactly what the death feigning entails with regard to the eastern hognose snake. We also have already talked about tail displays and autonomy, especially with lizards. And here, like we have this five-line skink. This is a juvenile five-line skink where the tail breaks off, it autotomizes, and allows the skink to run away, and the tail lies there wriggling and attracting the predator's attention so that they'll eat the tail while the lizard gets away. The last thing I want to talk about that you may not be familiar with is schooling. This is commonly seen in amphibian larvae, particularly tadpole schools. And here we have large numbers of tadpole larvae or tadpoles that move around in ponds as a large group. The idea here is that this group can be perceived by a predator as something other than a group of individual tadpoles. So thus a predator might look at this large black mass and think, man, that is one giant organism. I don't think that that's something that I can tackle and try to consume, even though it may consist of 1,000 larval tadpoles. Also, if you're a tadpole in this large mass of individuals that's moving from location to a location, being a member of this group reduces your probability of being captured. So if you're a tadpole out here hanging out by yourself, the probability of getting captured is much higher than the probability of being captured in this large school of cane tadpoles, for example. So that's it for today. That's really the basics of predator avoidance, predator escape that I wanted to touch on. And join me back here in a little bit, and we'll talk about lecture 13 as well.